878 AD. The kingdom of Wessex teetered on the edge of oblivion. King Alfred, a man barely 30 years old, crouched in the marshlands of Somerset with fewer than 100 loyal warriors. The once proud Saxon realm had been reduced to a handful of desperate men hiding in the reeds, while Viking armies celebrated in the halls of Winchester. Danish jarls drank from Alfred's own wine stores, their warriors dividing Saxon estates among themselves, already planning which churches to plunder next. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them, had systematically destroyed 3 of the 4 remaining Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, gone. East Anglia, conquered. Mercia, partitioned. Only Wessex remained, and it was dying. The Vikings weren't raiders anymore. They had evolved into conquerors, settlers who intended to replace Saxon England with a Scandinavian colony, stretching from the Scottish border to the English Channel. They called it the land taking, and by early 878, it seemed unstoppable. What those Danish warriors celebrating in Alfred's halls couldn't have imagined was that the shivering fugitive in the Somerset marshes would engineer the most remarkable military and social transformation in medieval European history. Within a decade, Alfred would create a defensive network so revolutionary that Viking armies, previously unstoppable, would find themselves unable to conquer a single Saxon town. Within a generation, those same Vikings would be learning English, converting to Christianity, and farming land they once would have burned. The weapon that achieved this transformation wasn't a new sword or a brilliant battle tactic. It was something far more mundane and infinitely more powerful, a network of fortified towns called Burhs. By the time Alfred died in 899, he had built 30 of these fortresses across Wessex, each positioned no more than 20 miles from its neighbour, creating an interlocking defensive grid that made the kingdom effectively unconquerable. But the Burhs did something even more remarkable than stopping Viking conquest. They accidentally created England's first true towns, kick-started a commercial revolution, and transformed both Saxon and Viking culture so completely that within 2 generations, the distinction between conqueror and conquered had blurred into a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian society. This is the story of how Alfred's Burhs didn't just defeat the Vikings. They absorbed them, domesticated them, and turned the most feared warriors in Europe into English shopkeepers. To understand the revolution Alfred created, we need to understand what he was fighting against. The Vikings who attacked England weren't the horn-helmeted barbarians of popular imagination. They were sophisticated warriors from a militarized society that had perfected the art of rapid amphibious warfare. The Great Heathen Army that landed in East Anglia in 865 wasn't a raiding party. It was an invasion force numbering perhaps 3,000 warriors, accompanied by families, blacksmiths, and supplies for permanent settlement. These weren't desperate adventurers. They were ambitious second sons from Norwegian and Danish estates, men who saw England's divided kingdoms as ripe for conquest. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Viking fleets using shallow draft longships that could navigate rivers and coastal waters equally well would strike deep into Saxon territory along waterways. They moved faster than any Saxon army could respond, fortified their bases with earthwork camps and used their mobility to avoid decisive battles, while systematically plundering the countryside. When Saxon armies did catch them, the Vikings simply retreated to their ships and relocated. Traditional Saxon military organisation couldn't counter this. The Fyrd, the militia system that called up free men for defensive service, was designed for short campaigns close to home. Farmers needed to return for planting and harvest. They couldn't chase Viking armies across the kingdom for months. The professional warriors of the king's household troops, the Thegns, were too few to cover England's vast coastline and navigable rivers. Between 865 and 878, the Vikings exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly. They captured York in 866, killed King Edmund of East Anglia in 869, conquered most of Mercia by 874, and seemed poised to complete their conquest with Wessex. The attack that nearly succeeded came in January 878, during the Christmas season when Saxon armies were disbanded. Guthrum, the Danish king leading the Great Heathen Army's Wessex campaign, launched a surprise winter offensive. His forces captured Chippenham, scattered Alfred's household troops, and forced the king into hiding. Most Saxon nobles submitted to Danish authority. The kingdom appeared finished, but Alfred possessed something more valuable than military strength. He understood systems. During his months in the marshes while his kingdom collapsed, Alfred wasn't just surviving, he was analysing why the Saxons kept losing and designing a solution that would revolutionise medieval warfare. The problem, Alfred realised, wasn't courage or fighting skill. Saxon warriors were individually equal to Vikings. The problem was strategic mobility and defensive infrastructure. The Vikings could strike anywhere while Saxons could defend nowhere. They needed to reverse that equation. Alfred's solution had multiple components, but the foundation was the Burh system. The concept wasn't entirely new. Fortified settlements existed throughout Europe, and Mercia had built some defensive works in the 8th century. But Alfred's innovation was scale, standardization, and integration into a comprehensive defensive strategy. The basic concept was elegant. Create a network of fortified towns positioned so that no point in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a burh. Since a man could walk 20 miles in a day, this meant every settlement, every farm, every church in the kingdom was within 1 day's reach of a defensible position. When Viking raiders appeared, the local population wouldn't flee blindly. They would retreat to the nearest burh, taking their livestock and portable wealth with them. The burh system was documented in a remarkable administrative text called the Burhs, compiled around 911 to 919, shortly after Alfred's death. This document lists 30 burhs and specifies exactly how many hides of land were assigned to maintain each one. A hide was a unit of land assessment, roughly equivalent to what could support one family, typically 120 acres. The document's mathematical precision reveals the sophisticated planning behind the system. The Burhs specifies that every hide of supporting land must provide 1 man for the garrison, and every pole of wall requires 4 men to defend it. A pole was 5.5 yards, so the math was straightforward. For every 5.5 yards of fortification, you needed 4 defenders. For every 4 defenders, you needed 4 hides of supporting land. This allowed planners to calculate exactly how much territory each burh needed to defend itself. Winchester, the largest burh, had 2,400 hides assigned to it, meaning it could garrison 2,400 men defending roughly 300 yards of walls. Smaller burhs like Ling had only 100 hides, supporting 100 men and 137 yards of fortifications. Archaeological excavations at multiple burh sites have confirmed the document's accuracy. The surviving earthworks and wall foundations matched the dimensions specified in the Burhs almost exactly, suggesting the system was implemented with remarkable precision. Building the burhs required mobilizing England's traditional labour obligation system for an unprecedented public works project. The Trinoda Necessitas, the threefold obligation, required all free men to contribute to 3 public duties: military service, bridge repair, and fortress work. Alfred expanded the fortress work obligation massively, essentially drafting the entire kingdom's labour force for construction. The scale was staggering. Winchester's walls enclosed 138 acres and measured over 3,000 yards in circumference. The earthwork defences included a ditch 12 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with the excavated earth piled into a rampart topped by a wooden palisade. Moving the earth alone required an estimated 60,000 man-days of labour. Multiply that across 30 fortresses, and Alfred's burh programme represents one of medieval Europe's largest construction projects, comparable to the great cathedral-building campaigns of later centuries. The burhs came in several types, each suited to its strategic location. Some, like Winchester and Exeter, were refurbished Roman towns whose ancient walls still stood and only needed repair and strengthening. The Romans had built well, and their stone fortifications, though 500 years old, provided excellent foundations. Other burhs were built from scratch at strategic locations. These typically featured earthwork defences, deep ditch surrounding a rampart topped with a wooden palisade, sometimes reinforced with stone at critical points like gates. The design was standardised. Most burhs used a rectangular or roughly circular plan with gates positioned to allow rapid deployment of defenders. Inside, streets were laid out in a grid pattern, a dramatic departure from the organic growth of traditional Saxon settlements. Archaeological work at places like Wareham and Wallingford has revealed these planned street grids, with properties divided into standardised plots. This wasn't accidental. Alfred's planners were creating purpose-built defensive communities, not organic villages that happened to have walls. The most innovative burhs were double fortresses, paired strongholds on opposite banks of rivers connected by fortified bridges. These controlled river crossings and prevented Viking fleets from penetrating inland. The Burhs at Oxford and Wallingford exemplify this design, blocking Thames navigation. Wareham controlled access to Poole Harbour. These river fortresses were particularly devastating to Viking strategy because they neutralised the raiders' greatest advantage: mobility via waterways. A Viking fleet finding a fortified bridge blocking their advance had three bad options: attack the fortress directly and face heavy casualties, portage their ships overland around the obstacle, an exhausting process that left them vulnerable, or turn back. The Burhs transformed warfare in Wessex from chasing mobile raiders to forcing them into predictable confrontations at defensive strongpoints. But fortifications alone don't win wars. Alfred understood that static defences could be bypassed unless connected to mobile forces. His second major innovation was reorganising the fyrd, the militia system. The traditional fyrd mobilised all able-bodied free men for defence, but this meant entire regions were defenceless when armies marched away. Alfred split the fyrd into two rotating divisions. Half the men served in the army, while half remained home maintaining farms and local defence. This created a standing field army that could campaign for extended periods while still maintaining agricultural production. The reformed fyrd was organised around the Burhs. Each fortress served as a mustering point and supply depot for its district. When Vikings threatened a region, the local fyrd would deploy from the nearest burh, supplied and supported from its stores. If outnumbered, they could retreat to the fortress and hold until reinforcements arrived from neighbouring burhs. This system appeared in action almost immediately. In May 878, Alfred emerged from the Somerset marshes and summoned the fyrd of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire. The men gathered at Egbert's Stone and then marched to Eddington, where they met Guthrum's Danish army. Alfred won decisively, besieged Guthrum's forces at Chippenham and forced terms. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore divided England between Saxon and Danish territories, with the Danes controlling the north and east, the area that became known as the Danelaw, while Alfred secured Wessex and western Mercia. But military victory only bought time. The treaty didn't end Viking pressure. Throughout the 1880s and 890s, new Viking armies arrived from Scandinavia and France, testing Wessex's defences repeatedly. This was when the burh system proved its true worth. In 892, a massive Viking force estimated at over 200 ships landed in Kent and established a fortified base at Appledore. This army, veterans of decades of campaigning in France, represented perhaps the most formidable Viking force ever to attack England. They were experienced, well-equipped, and led by skilled commanders who had fought against Frankish armies. Their strategy was traditional Viking warfare: establish a fortified base, raid the surrounding territory for supplies and plunder, move rapidly to avoid Saxon armies, and slowly extend control. What happened next astonished contemporaries. The Viking army spent 4 years, from 892 to 896, campaigning in southern England and achieved virtually nothing. They captured no significant territory, founded no permanent settlements, and were eventually forced to disperse in failure. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's account of these years reads like a catalogue of Viking frustration. The Vikings march up the Thames Valley but find all the burhs garrisoned and cannot take them. They raid toward Chester, but the population has retreated to the burh with their livestock. They besiege Exeter, but cannot take it before Alfred's field army arrives. They attempt to advance along the Severn, but the fortified bridges are held against them. Every river crossing is blocked. Every population centre is fortified. Every raid finds the countryside stripped of supplies. The Vikings could win individual skirmishes, but they couldn't conquer territory because they couldn't take the burhs, and they couldn't bypass the burhs because the surrounding population was protected by them. The Battle of Buttington in 893 exemplified the system's effectiveness. A Viking force advancing up the Severn River found itself caught between the river and converging Saxon armies from multiple burhs. Unable to retreat to their ships, unwilling to storm the fortifications, the Vikings were besieged and eventually forced to break out with heavy losses. This wasn't a dramatic battlefield victory like Eddington, it was systematic military strangulation. The Vikings found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by a defensive network that channeled their movements and denied them the initiative. By 896, the great Viking army that had terrified England for 4 years simply fell apart. Some warriors returned to Scandinavia, others settled in the Danelaw. Some even accepted land in Wessex under Saxon authority. The Chronicle laconically notes that by 896, the Viking army had dispersed, some to East Anglia, some to Northumbria, and those who were without property got themselves ships and went south across the sea to the Seine. This understated passage marks one of history's pivotal moments. For the first time, a major Viking army had been defeated not by a single battle, but by a systematic defensive strategy that made conquest impossible. But the Burhs did more than stop Vikings. They accidentally revolutionized English society and economy in ways Alfred's planners never anticipated. Pre-Viking Saxon England was overwhelmingly rural. People lived in villages and isolated farmsteads. Trade was limited. Artisans worked in manor workshops. Markets were seasonal affairs. The few towns that existed, mostly former Roman cities like London and York, functioned primarily as administrative and religious centres, not commercial hubs. The Burhs changed this completely. Creating 30 fortified settlements required populating them with permanent residents. Garrison troops needed food, weapons, clothing and equipment. Fortifications needed constant maintenance. Empty fortresses were useless. Alfred's solution was to offer significant incentives for settlement. The laws of Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, specify special legal privileges for Burh residents. They had access to the Burhs market, protection from arbitrary exactions, and the right to appeal directly to royal courts. Most importantly, Burh residents could engage in trade and crafts while still maintaining their free status, something difficult in the traditional agricultural economy, where landless free men were rare. People responded by moving to the Burhs in surprising numbers. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites shows rapid urbanization beginning in the late 9th century. At Winchester, excavations revealed extensive industrial activity starting around 880 to 890. Leatherworking, textile production, metalworking and pottery all appear suddenly in the archaeological record. This wasn't gradual urban growth over centuries, it was rapid urbanization within a generation, driven by the Burhs' commercial opportunities. The standardized street grids weren't just for defense, they facilitated commerce. Properties fronting the main streets were divided into narrow plots, typically about 20 feet wide but extending back 100 feet or more. This created maximum street frontage for shops and workshops while providing work and storage space behind. Excavations at multiple Burhs have revealed these plots developed quickly into commercial properties, with workshops fronting the street and living quarters behind. The Burh system included a revolutionary economic policy. Each Burh had the right to hold a market, and only Burhs could have markets. This concentrated trade in fortified, controlled locations where the king's officials could supervise transactions, collect tolls, and maintain standards. The laws of Edward the Elder made this explicit. All buying and selling must take place within towns before witnesses. This apparently simple regulation had profound effects. It forced commerce into the Burhs, ensuring their economic viability. It allowed taxation of trade. It created standardized markets where merchants knew they could buy and sell under consistent rules. Within a generation, the Burhs had become genuine towns in the modern sense. They had permanent populations engaged in specialized crafts and trade, regular markets, diverse occupations and urban identities distinct from the surrounding countryside. Archaeological evidence shows increasing specialization. At Wareham, excavations found distinct craft quarters, with metalworkers concentrated in one area, leatherworkers in another. At Oxford, pottery production concentrated near the gates where carts could easily collect finished goods. This level of economic specialization required surplus agricultural production to feed non-farming urban populations, which in turn required improved farming efficiency. The Burh system thus catalyzed agricultural intensification in the surrounding countryside. The Burhs also became cultural centres. Alfred, deeply committed to educational reform, established schools in the major Burhs. He recruited scholars from Wales, Francia and Mercia to teach Latin and translate essential texts into English. The king believed an educated administration was essential for effective governance, and the Burhs provided the infrastructure to support this. Winchester especially became a centre of learning and manuscript production. The Winchester School of Illumination, which would flourish in the 10th century, had its roots in Alfred's educational reforms. By making literacy and learning available in urban centres rather than restricting them to monasteries, Alfred began a slow democratization of knowledge. Perhaps most remarkably, the Burhs began attracting Scandinavian settlers. Vikings who had raided England for silver discovered they could make more money as merchants in Burh markets than as warriors in the increasingly dangerous raiding business. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. By the early 10th century, Scandinavian names appear in witness lists from Burh charters. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavian-style jewellery and weapons being produced in Burh workshops, not as foreign imports, but as local manufacture for a mixed population. York in Danish-controlled territory provides the most dramatic example. Although not part of Alfred's original system, York developed under Viking rule along similar lines, becoming a major commercial centre. Excavations at Coppergate have revealed extensive evidence of Scandinavian artisans working leather, wood, metal and textiles for local and export markets. By the mid-10th century, York had perhaps 10,000 residents, making it one of Northern Europe's largest cities. This urbanisation under Viking rule suggests the Burh model's appeal transcended ethnic boundaries. Scandinavian settlers recognised the commercial opportunities fortified urban centres provided. The process of cultural integration accelerated in the Burhs. Saxons and Scandinavians lived as neighbours, traded in the same markets, and increasingly intermarried. Language evolved into a hybrid. Old Norse and Old English, already related Germanic languages, began merging. Many English words with Scandinavian roots entered the language during this period: sky, egg, husband, window, knife. Grammatical structures simplified as speakers from both backgrounds sought mutual comprehension. By the mid-10th century, distinguishing Saxon from Scandinavian in southern England was becoming increasingly difficult. People had hybrid names like Grim's son or Alfred's son, combining elements from both cultures. Material culture blurred as Scandinavian dress styles influenced English fashion, while Scandinavian settlers adopted English agricultural techniques. Christianity played a crucial role in this integration. As part of the Treaty of Wedmore, Guthrum and his leading men accepted baptism. While initially this may have been merely political, Christianity provided a shared cultural framework that facilitated integration. Churches were built in the Burhs, serving mixed congregations. Christian morality, emphasizing peace and social order, aligned perfectly with the commercial culture developing in the towns. A merchant benefited more from contract enforcement than from raiding. Second and third generation Scandinavian settlers, raised Christian in increasingly English-speaking towns, had little connection to their grandparents' warrior culture. They were becoming English, or more accurately helping create a new Anglo-Scandinavian English identity. By 920, when Edward the Elder completed the conquest of the Danelaw, absorbing it into an expanded Wessex kingdom, the distinction between Saxon and Danish territory was becoming meaningless. The Burhs had done more than defend Wessex. They had created a cultural and economic integration that made political unification natural rather than forced. The economic impact extended beyond England. The Burhs became part of an expanding North Sea trade network. Archaeological finds include pottery from the Rhineland, metalwork from Scandinavia, wine from France, and even occasional exotic items from the Mediterranean and beyond. English wool, leather and metalwork flowed outward in exchange. This commercial expansion was possible because the Burhs provided secure trading locations with standardized weights, measures, and legal protections. A Frankish merchant arriving at a Burh knew the market would be peaceful, contracts enforced and disputes adjudicated fairly. This predictability was revolutionary in an age when trade often required armed guards and private negotiations. Alfred and his successors standardized coinage, further facilitating commerce. The silver penny became a reliable unit of exchange. Royal mints, located in the Burhs, produced consistent weight and purity coins bearing the king's image and the town's name. This created both a practical currency and a propaganda tool. Every transaction reminded people who maintained the peace that made trade possible. The social transformations were equally profound. Traditional Saxon society was rigidly hierarchical. You were born into a status, peasant or noble, and remained there. Social mobility was nearly impossible. The Burhs created new opportunities. A farmer's son could become a merchant. A craftsman could accumulate wealth rivaling minor nobles. Skills and enterprise could elevate status in ways unthinkable in rural agricultural society. This nascent meritocracy remained limited. The nobility still dominated landholding and political power. But the Burhs created space for an emerging middle class of merchants, skilled craftsmen, and urban property owners. This class would eventually challenge noble monopolies on power, though that process took centuries. Women found expanded opportunities in Burh economies. Traditional agricultural society offered women few roles outside family farming. Urban economies created demand for specialized skills women could provide. Textile production, always women's work, became a commercial industry. Brewing, food preparation, and small-scale retailing provided income opportunities. Evidence from later periods suggests women could own property, operate businesses, and achieve economic independence impossible in rural settings. The legal status of Burh residents evolved rapidly. Traditional English law recognized two main classes of free people: the landowning class who owed military service and the landless but free labourers. Urban merchants and craftsmen fit neither category. They owned property, but it was urban real estate, not agricultural land. They were wealthy, but didn't owe traditional military service. The law adapted by creating special urban liberties. Burh residents answered to urban courts using modified legal procedures. They paid taxes through their Burhs corporate assessment rather than as individuals. They elected representatives to manage municipal affairs. These developments, still primitive in Alfred's time, were revolutionary. They marked the beginning of municipal self-governance in England, a process that would eventually lead to parliamentary representation and constitutional government. By the time of Alfred's death in 899, the transformation was undeniable. The kingdom he had inherited in 871 was a collection of rural territories, barely connected by primitive roads, vulnerable to any attacker with ships and determination. The kingdom he left his son Edward was a network of fortified urban centres, connected by trade and administration, capable of defeating any threat through systematic defence. His successors built on this foundation. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, extended the Burh system into Mercia and began the conquest of the Danelaw. His strategy was straightforward: build a burh, garrison it, extend administrative control. Over the surrounding territory, repeat. By his death in 924, Edward ruled from the Channel to the Humber, all organised around the Burh network. Athelstan, Edward's son, completed the unification by conquering York in 927. For the first time, a single king ruled all of England. This unification was possible because the Burh system provided the administrative infrastructure to govern a kingdom. Each burh served as a regional capital, where royal authority was exercised through appointed officials who collected taxes, enforced laws, maintained defences, and adjudicated disputes. The English state emerging from this system was remarkably sophisticated for the 10th century. It had standardised administration across regions, a professional bureaucracy literate in Latin and English, regular taxation based on written assessments, enforceable law codes applied consistently throughout the realm. This was the foundation for England's eventual development into medieval Europe's most effectively governed kingdom. The military effectiveness of the Burh system continued demonstrating itself through the 10th century. When Viking raids resumed in the 980s and 990s, now led by Scandinavian kings rather than independent warlords, they found England far harder to conquer than before. The raiders could still win battles and extract tribute, but they couldn't establish permanent control outside the areas they physically occupied. The Burhs remained unconquerable strongpoints. Sween Forkbeard and Nut eventually conquered England in the early 11th century, but they did so through sustained campaigns lasting years, and even then, they succeeded partly because English leadership failed rather than because they defeated the defensive system. Once in power, Nut maintained the Burh network because it was how England was governed. The system Alfred created survived changes of dynasty, because it was simply too useful to abandon. The cultural legacy extended far beyond England. The concept of fortified urban centres as both military strongpoints and commercial hubs spread across northern Europe. German kings developed similar systems in their eastern territories. Scandinavian monarchs fortified trading towns like Hedeby and Birka. The medieval European town, with its walls, market rights, and special legal status, owed much to the model Alfred pioneered. The process of Viking integration through urbanization and Christianity occurred across northern Europe. In Normandy, Danish raiders who settled the Seine Valley in the early 10th century underwent similar transformation, becoming French-speaking Christians within 2 generations. In Scotland and Ireland, Norse settlements developed into major trading towns like Dublin and Waterford. The pattern Alfred established repeated itself wherever Vikings settled in Christian territories with strong states. Military pressure forced settlement. Urbanization created economic opportunities more attractive than raiding. Christianity provided cultural integration, and within generations the descendants of raiders became merchants and farmers. For the Vikings themselves, the transformation was double-edged. Their military culture, celebrated in sagas and poems, valued courage, martial skill, and warrior glory above all. The life of a merchant or farmer, however prosperous, lacked the prestige of the warrior. Yet economic reality was undeniable. By the mid-10th century, young Scandinavians seeking fortune increasingly chose trade over raiding. The poem Rigsthula, composed around this period, reflects changing attitudes. It describes three social classes: thralls, free farmers, and nobles, with the free farmer presented as the ideal, prosperous, respected, and free. The glory-seeking warrior appears primarily as a costly burden. This represented a fundamental shift in Scandinavian culture. The Viking Age was ending not because Scandinavians were defeated, but because they were absorbed into a more prosperous, stable, and attractive culture. The Burhs hadn't destroyed Viking culture through military conquest. They had offered something better: security, prosperity, and opportunity. The archaeological evidence from later medieval English towns shows the complete success of this integration. By the 11th century, distinguishing Scandinavian from Saxon in the material culture of English towns is nearly impossible. The populations had merged completely. Even in areas of heaviest Scandinavian settlement, like the 5 boroughs of Leicester, Derby, Nottingham, Lincoln, and Stamford, the culture was uniformly English, with only linguistic and naming patterns revealing the region's history. The economic legacy was equally profound. The commercial revolution the Burhs catalyzed continued accelerating through the medieval period. By 1086, when the Domesday Book surveyed England for William the Conqueror, the kingdom supported over 100 towns, most originally founded as burhs or developed from them. These towns formed the backbone of England's medieval economy, collecting and distributing goods, housing specialized craftsmen, and connecting England to European trade networks. England's unusual political stability in the medieval period, relative to the continent's endless wars, owed much to the administrative system Alfred created. The burh network became the shire system of county administration, which persisted essentially unchanged until the 19th century. This gave England a professional bureaucracy and effective local government centuries before most European states developed similar systems. The judicial system also showed Alfred's legacy. English common law, developing from the 12th century onward, built on traditions of local courts and written law codes that traced back to Alfred's reforms. The principle that law applied equally to all free men, revolutionary in the 9th century, became foundational to English political culture. Alfred himself became legendary, the only English king, called the Great. Medieval chroniclers praised his wisdom, his military victories, and his learning. But they often missed the real genius of his achievement. He didn't defeat the Vikings through superior force. He created a system that made Viking conquest pointless, because the conquered territories would simply absorb the conquerors. The irony was perfect. The Vikings came to England seeking land, wealth, and glory. Alfred gave them land, but as farmers rather than conquerors. He gave them wealth, but as merchants rather than raiders. As for glory, it disappeared into the mundane prosperity of urban commercial life. The transformation from raider to farmer wasn't forced at sword point. It was chosen generation by generation as people realized that prosperity and security offered more than violence and uncertainty. The Burhs made that choice possible by providing an alternative to warrior culture that was genuinely attractive. By the middle of the 10th century, when England was unified under Alfred's descendants, the Viking threat had evaporated not because the Vikings were defeated, but because they had become English. The process was so complete that when new waves of Scandinavian invasion came in the late 10th century, many English leaders had Scandinavian names and ancestry. They defended England not as conquered subjects but as English patriots whose grandparents happened to arrive in longships. The strategic genius of Alfred's system lay in understanding that military defence alone couldn't solve the Viking problem. As long as raiding was more profitable than farming, warriors would keep coming. Alfred made raiding unprofitable through defensive fortifications, while simultaneously making settlement profitable through economic opportunity. He didn't just defeat an army, he eliminated the economic foundation for Viking warfare. Modern military strategists studying insurgency and counterinsurgency have much to learn from Alfred's approach. He understood that you can't kill your way out of a security problem rooted in economic and social conditions. You have to change the conditions that make violence attractive. The Burhs did exactly that. They protected the population while creating economic opportunities that made peaceful settlement more attractive than continued warfare. The integration of Scandinavian settlers wasn't without tension. Anglo-Saxon sources occasionally reference conflicts between Saxon and Danish populations. Laws from the period specified different compensation rates for Saxons and Danes, suggesting legal recognition of distinct populations. But these distinctions faded quickly, probably within 2 or 3 generations. By the time England unified in the 920s, mixed populations were the norm in most of the former Danelaw. The linguistic legacy provides perhaps the clearest evidence of integration. Modern English retains hundreds of words from Old Norse, particularly in areas of heavier Scandinavian settlement. But the borrowing goes both ways, and the grammar of the two languages merged rather than one dominating the other. This suggests genuine population mixing and bilingualism, rather than one culture imposing itself on another. The place name evidence tells a similar story. Many English towns have Scandinavian names or name elements, particularly the suffixes by meaning farm or village, thorp meaning outlying settlement, and thwaite meaning clearing. But these names often include English personal names or elements, suggesting mixed populations from the beginning. By the 11th century, England had emerged from Alfred's defensive strategy as something unprecedented, a unified kingdom with a mixed Anglo-Scandinavian population, an effective central government, a developing commercial economy, and an urban network that would support prosperity and growth for centuries. None of this was inevitable. Had Alfred died in the Somerset marshes in 878, or had he been a conventional warrior king who sought only military victory, English history would have been entirely different. The Vikings might have completed their conquest, creating a Scandinavian England similar to their settlements in Normandy or the Scottish Isles, or England might have fragmented into perpetual warfare between Saxon and Danish kingdoms. Alfred's genius was seeing beyond immediate military crisis to understand that sustainable security required transforming the economic and social landscape. The Burhs were the physical manifestation of that understanding. They were fortresses, but they were also towns. They were military installations, but they were also markets. They defended against Vikings, but they also absorbed them. The paradox at the heart of Alfred's achievement is that his greatest victory wasn't the Battle of Edington in 878, celebrated in chronicles and legend. It was the quiet transformation of Viking raiders into English merchants and farmers, a process so gradual and undramatic that contemporaries barely noticed it happening. By the time anyone recognised the full extent of the change, it was complete. The Burhs still stand, many of them. Winchester, Wallingford, Oxford, Exeter, and dozens of others remain important English towns, their street patterns still following the grids laid out in the 880s and 890s. Walk through their medieval centres and you're following routes planned by Alfred's engineers 100 years ago. The walls are gone, replaced by ring roads and shopping streets. The military function has vanished. But the towns remain, testament to the enduring utility of Alfred's vision. In 878, Viking armies celebrating in Winchester's halls thought they had conquered England. They were wrong. England was about to conquer them, not with swords, but with something far more powerful, the offer of a better life behind the walls of Alfred's Burhs. Within a generation, the sons of Vikings were learning English, the grandsons were Christian, and the great-grandsons barely remembered. Their ancestors had once been raiders. The Burhs had turned the most feared warriors in Europe into shopkeepers, and in doing so, they had created England. The long-term consequences of the Burh system extended far beyond the immediate military crisis Alfred faced. By creating a network of fortified urban centres, he inadvertently established the framework for English exceptionalism that would define the nation for centuries. The administrative sophistication, commercial vitality, and cultural integration the Burhs fostered gave England advantages that contemporaries barely recognised, but which would prove decisive in European history. The fiscal implications of maintaining 30 fortified towns created England's first truly national taxation system. Before Alfred, Saxon kings funded themselves primarily through rents from royal estates and occasional emergency levies. The Burh system required something more systematic and permanent. Every hide of land in Wessex was assessed, recorded, and assigned obligations for fortress maintenance. This wasn't temporary war taxation. It was permanent infrastructure funding that required continuous administration. The Domesday Book of 1086, compiled 2 centuries after Alfred, built directly on administrative systems developed for the Burhs. William the Conqueror's clerks could survey England systematically because the framework already existed. Every piece of land was already assessed, recorded, and assigned to administrative units. The Norman conquest changed who received the revenues, but the collection system itself was Saxon, rooted in Alfred's Burh obligations. This gave England a fiscal advantage over continental kingdoms that lasted for centuries. French kings, even in the 13th century, struggled to assess and tax their territories systematically. They relied on feudal obligations, tolls, and arbitrary exactions. English kings, by contrast, had inherited a system that could assess the entire kingdom, calculate taxes owed, and collect them with reasonable efficiency. This administrative superiority translated directly into military and political power. The commercial networks developing around the Burhs created England's first truly national economy. Before Alfred, English trade was primarily local or external. Villages traded with nearby settlements, and a few port towns engaged in overseas commerce, but there was little internal trade connecting different regions. The Burh system changed this fundamentally. Each burh served as a collection point for agricultural produce from its supporting hides and a distribution centre for goods from other regions. A burh in Wessex might receive wool from local farmers, pottery from Midlands workshops, metalwork from Mercian craftsmen, and imported wine from continental traders. These goods were then redistributed to other burhs through travelling merchants who moved between fortified markets. This created economic interdependence across England. A farmer in Somerset might wear shoes made in York from leather tanned in Chester using techniques learned from Scandinavian immigrants. His wife might cook in pottery from Stamford, using iron tools forged in Winchester, wearing wool clothing dyed with materials from half a dozen sources. This economic integration made political unity natural because it reflected existing commercial reality. The standardization of weights, measures, and coinage accelerated this commercial integration. Alfred established royal mints in major burhs, producing silver pennies of consistent weight and purity. These coins bore the king's image on one side and the burh's name on the other, creating a standardized currency that facilitated trade while advertising royal authority. A merchant could accept Winchester coins in York knowing they contained the same silver content as local coins. The enforcement of standard measures was equally important. Royal officials in each burh maintained official measures for grain, cloth, and other commodities. Merchants had to use these standards or face penalties. This prevented the chaos of competing measurement systems and created trust between buyers and sellers from different regions. A bushel of wheat meant the same thing in every burh market. These commercial standards seem mundane, but their impact was revolutionary. They reduced transaction costs, making trade more profitable. They created predictability, encouraging merchants to invest in inventory and transport. They built trust, allowing credit relationships to develop between merchants who'd never met. The result was a commercial revolution that increased wealth across England. For Scandinavian settlers, this commercial system offered opportunities their homelands couldn't match. Norway and Denmark had limited internal trade and few urban centres. Commerce meant primarily overseas raiding and trading expeditions, dangerous and uncertain. The English burh system offered safe, predictable domestic trade that could generate steady income. A Danish merchant could travel a circuit of burh markets, buying wool in the west, selling it in the east, purchasing metalwork there and selling it in the south, accumulating profit at each transaction. This kind of commercial career was nearly impossible in Scandinavia, but routine in England. The legal framework protecting merchants was equally important. Royal law specified that violence against merchants travelling to or from markets was a serious crime against the king's peace, punishable by heavy fines or death. Roads connecting burhs received special protection. Theft from merchants was prosecuted vigorously. These protections made commerce safer than it had ever been, encouraging more people to engage in trade. The development of credit and financial instruments in English Burhs was remarkably sophisticated for the 10th century. Merchants began extending credit to reliable customers, allowing purchases before payment. They developed promissory notes that could be redeemed at different burhs, avoiding the need to transport large amounts of silver. They created partnerships that pooled capital for large trading ventures, sharing both risk and profit. These financial innovations required literate, numerate merchants who could maintain accounts and honour contracts. The education system developing in the Burhs provided exactly this. Merchants' sons learned reading, writing and arithmetic in Burh schools, making them capable of sophisticated commercial operations. This created a commercial class whose skills were transmissible to their children, establishing merchant dynasties that would dominate English trade for generations. The social mobility this commercial economy enabled was unprecedented in medieval society. A farmer's son with talent for trade could apprentice to a merchant, learn the business, and eventually establish his own trading operation. Within a generation, a family could move from agricultural labour to commercial prosperity. This wasn't common, but it was possible in ways that simply weren't true in more rigid continental societies. For Scandinavian immigrants, this mobility was particularly attractive. In Scandinavia, social status was largely fixed by birth. You were born a farmer or a warrior, and remained that. The English system offered the possibility of transformation through commercial success. A Danish settler who arrived as a warrior could become a merchant through effort and skill, and his sons could become wealthy traders. This promise of advancement made integration attractive and rapid. The physical development of burhs into genuine urban centres created new types of social space that facilitated integration. In villages, everyone knew everyone's ancestry and ethnic background. But in burhs with populations of thousands, anonymity was possible. A second-generation Scandinavian immigrant could move to a new burh and establish himself based on skill and wealth rather than ancestry. This social fluidity accelerated cultural merger by making ethnic background less important than commercial reputation. The craft specialization developing in burhs created occupational identities that cross-cut ethnic divisions. Leatherworkers formed professional associations regardless of whether members were Saxon or Scandinavian. What mattered was skill at the craft, reliability in business, and willingness to maintain quality standards. These guilds became powerful forces for integration by making occupation more important than ancestry. The archaeological evidence for craft specialization is striking. At 10th century York, excavations revealed distinct craft quarters where leatherworkers, metalworkers, woodworkers, and textile producers concentrated. Within these quarters, Saxon and Scandinavian names appear together in later documentary sources, suggesting mixed ethnic composition. The craftsmen worked side by side, learned from each other, and gradually developed hybrid techniques combining Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. The textile industry particularly shows this cultural synthesis. Scandinavian settlers introduced new wool processing techniques and loom designs. Saxon weavers adopted these innovations while maintaining traditional English patterns. The result was textiles that couldn't be classified as purely Saxon or Scandinavian, using Scandinavian production methods to create English patterns with mixed design vocabularies. This hybrid craft production paralleled the cultural synthesis happening in language, religion, and social organization. The development of specialized craft production for export markets transformed English manufacturing. Before the burh system, most craft work was either household production for family use or estate production serving a lord's needs. The burhs created concentrated markets large enough to support full-time craftsmen producing for sale. This allowed specialization and quality improvements impossible with part-time production. English wool textiles became increasingly sought after in continental markets during the 10th century. English metalwork, particularly weapons and jewellery, gained reputation for quality. English pottery, produced in specialised workshops at burhs like Stamford and Thetford, was traded across northern Europe. This export production brought wealth into England while advertising English sophistication to continental observers. The urban culture developing in the burhs created new forms of social organisation and identity. Urban residents developed loyalties to their town that transcended ethnic background. A Winchester merchant might feel more kinship with fellow Winchester residents, whether Saxon or Scandinavian, than with Saxons from other regions. This urban identity became a third category alongside Saxon and Scandinavian ethnicity, eventually superseding both. The visual culture of the Burhs reinforced this new identity. Churches commissioned art celebrating local saints and history. Public buildings displayed royal and urban symbols. Markets became theatres for displaying wealth and status through clothing, jewellery and consumption. All of this created shared cultural reference points that residents understood regardless of ethnic background. The festival calendar in the Burhs created regular occasions for community gathering that integrated diverse populations. Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter brought everyone to church services. Market days created weekly social gatherings. Annual fairs attracted merchants and entertainers from across England and beyond. These regular assemblies created a sense of community that gradually eroded ethnic distinctions. The food culture developing in English Burhs showed remarkable synthesis of Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. Excavations of 10th century urban sites revealed dietary patterns combining English and Scandinavian elements. Saxon bread and pottage alongside Scandinavian preserved fish. English ale with Scandinavian dairy products. The spice palette expanded as merchants imported new flavours, creating cuisine that was distinctly English rather than purely Saxon or Scandinavian. Taverns and alehouses became important social spaces where ethnic mixing occurred naturally. In these establishments, language barriers broke down through drink and conversation. Business deals were negotiated, marriages arranged, and friendships formed. The informal social networks developing in Burh drinking establishments probably did more to integrate Saxon and Scandinavian populations than any official policy. The evolution of English law during the 10th century reflected ongoing cultural synthesis. Alfred's law code had established basic framework, but his successors refined and expanded it. The laws of Edward the Elder, Athelstan, and later kings incorporated elements from both Saxon and Scandinavian legal traditions. The resulting hybrid legal system took the best features of both, creating something more sophisticated than either predecessor. From Scandinavian tradition came the concept of the jury, ordinary men sworn to give true testimony about facts of a case. From Saxon tradition came emphasis on written law and royal authority superseding private revenge. The merger created a legal system where local juries determined facts, while royal judges applied standardized law. This system, refined over centuries, became the foundation of English common law, one of history's most influential legal traditions. The development of towns as corporate entities, with legal personality separate from their residents, was another innovation with lasting impact. By the late 10th century, Burhs were making collective agreements, owning property as communities, and being treated as legal entities. This corporate identity provided framework for eventual development of municipal self-government and ultimately parliamentary representation. The agricultural hinterland supporting the Burhs underwent transformation as profound as the urban centres themselves. The constant demand for food, raw materials and manufactured goods in the Burhs created incentives for agricultural innovation and intensification. Farmers near Burhs began specialising, growing crops or raising livestock specifically for urban markets rather than for subsistence. This market-oriented agriculture required different techniques than subsistence farming. Farmers needed to produce surpluses consistently, not just in good years. They needed to time production for market demand. They needed to maintain quality standards for urban customers. These requirements drove innovation in farming methods, crop selection, and livestock management. The introduction of the heavy-wheeled plough during this period, though not directly caused by the Burh system, was accelerated by commercial agriculture's demands. This plough could break heavy clay soils previously uncultivable, expanding farmland and increasing production. The investment required to own a heavy plough was justified by increased yields that could be sold in Burh markets. Subsistence farmers couldn't afford such equipment, but commercial farmers serving urban markets could. The development of watermills for grinding grain was similarly accelerated by commercial demand. Mills were expensive to build and maintain, requiring significant capital investment. They made economic sense only with volume processing for market sale, not for household grinding. By the 11th century, England had thousands of watermills, far more per capita than continental countries. This reflected the commercial agricultural economy the Burh system had created. For Scandinavian settlers taking up farming, the English system offered substantial advantages over Scandinavian agriculture. England's climate and soils were generally more favourable than Norway's marginal farmland. English farming techniques, refined over centuries, produced higher yields. Most importantly, English Burr markets provided reliable outlets for surplus production, making commercial farming profitable. The social status of successful farmers in this commercial system was notably higher than in traditional Scandinavian society. In Norway or Denmark, farmers were respectable but undistinguished. In England, a farmer who consistently supplied Burr markets with quality produce could accumulate substantial wealth and status. His sons might move into commerce or even minor nobility. This social mobility made farming attractive to Scandinavian settlers in ways it hadn't been in their homeland. The environmental impact of this agricultural intensification was significant. Forests were cleared for additional farmland, wetlands were drained for pasture, rivers were dammed for mill ponds. The English landscape was being transformed from wilderness and scattered settlements into a managed agricultural system optimized for production. This environmental modification, driven by commercial agriculture serving boer markets, created the intensively farmed landscape that still characterizes England. The road system connecting Burhs became increasingly sophisticated during the 10th century. While Roman roads still provided main routes, new roads were built connecting Burhs not on Roman routes. These roads required maintenance, with adjacent landowners obligated to keep them passable. Bridges were built or rebuilt at river crossings, often fortified to control traffic and collect tolls. The improved transportation network facilitated not just commerce, but also military mobility, administrative communication, and cultural exchange. Royal messengers could travel rapidly between Burhs, carrying orders and information. Military forces could deploy quickly to threatened areas. Merchants could move goods efficiently. This infrastructure bound England together in ways that made political unity practical and sustainable. The postal and messenger systems developing along, these routes created information networks that gave English governments significant advantages. A king in Winchester could communicate with officials in York within days, issuing orders and receiving reports far more rapidly than continental monarchs could manage. This administrative responsiveness made English government more effective than the size of the kingdom alone would suggest. The intellectual culture developing in boor schools and monasteries created an educated administrative class that gave England continuing advantages. These clerks and priests, trained in Latin and English, literate and numerate, formed a professional bureaucracy that could implement royal policy effectively. They maintained records, collected taxes, adjudicated disputes, and administered justice with consistency impossible in kingdoms relying on purely personal rule. The manuscript production of 10th and 11th century England reveals this intellectual vitality. English scriptoria produced not just religious texts, but also historical chronicles, legal codes, scientific treatises, and vernacular literature in remarkable quantities. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, continued in multiple monasteries across England, provided an indigenous historical tradition unique in Western Europe. Most continental kingdoms had histories written in Latin by churchmen. England had a vernacular chronicle written in English by English authors for English audiences. This vernacular literary culture, unusual in medieval Europe, was partly consequence of Alfred's educational reforms and partly result of the hybrid society the Burhs created. With populations mixing linguistically, creating complex English from Saxon and Scandinavian roots, there was practical need for written English that could be understood by everyone. Latin served church purposes, but administration and commerce needed English. The poetry and prose literature produced in this environment shows remarkable sophistication. The great heroic poems like Beowulf, whatever their earlier origins, were copied and preserved in 10th century scriptoria. New religious poetry was composed in English. Historical works, scientific texts, and practical manuals were translated from Latin into English. This created a literate culture in the vernacular that wouldn't emerge in most of Europe until centuries later. For Scandinavian settlers and their descendants, this English literary culture provided another integration mechanism. Learning to read English meant absorbing not just language, but entire cultural tradition preserved in texts. The great English poems, the historical chronicles, the saints' lives all conveyed English values, history, and identity. Scandinavian children learning to read in Burr schools were simultaneously learning to be English through the texts they studied. The religious architecture developing in the Burhs demonstrated the wealth and cultural confidence of this emerging society. The great stone churches built in major Burhs during the 10th century were ambitious structures by any standard. Winchester Cathedral, rebuilt under Edgar in the 960s, was among Northern Europe's largest churches. Its size and sophistication announced England's arrival as a major European power. These churches employed architectural vocabularies, combining Saxon traditions with influences from Carolingian Francia and even Byzantium. The result was a distinctive English Romanesque style that influenced European architecture for generations. This architectural synthesis paralleled the cultural integration happening in every other aspect of English life. The political evolution of England during the 10th century built on the foundation the Burhs provided. When Edward the Elder completed the conquest of the Danelaw, he did so by building new burhs in conquered territories and garrisoning them. This wasn't military occupation in the traditional sense, it was extension of the administrative and economic system that succeeded in Wessex. The former Danish territories were absorbed not through military subjugation, but through integration into the Burh network. Merchants from Wessex traded in Danelaw burhs. Farmers from Danish areas sold produce in Saxon markets. Royal officials collected taxes and administered justice using the same systems throughout the kingdom. Within a generation, the Danelaw wasn't a conquered territory. It was simply another region of England, distinguished only by higher concentrations of Scandinavian place names and inhabitants. This administrative approach to conquest and integration was unusual in medieval Europe. Most conquests were military affairs where victors extracted tribute from defeated populations while maintaining ethnic separation. English policy, building on Alfred's model, was fundamentally assimilationist. The goal wasn't to rule over distinct populations, but to create a unified kingdom where ethnic background became increasingly irrelevant. The reign of Athelstan, who unified England in 927, demonstrated the success of this approach. Athelstan's court included nobles from Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and the Danelaw, both Saxon and Scandinavian in ancestry. His laws applied throughout England without ethnic distinction. His coins circulated from Kent to Northumbria. His government functioned as a single administrative unit, not as a confederation of separate territories. The European reputation of Anglo-Saxon England during the 10th century reflected this internal success. Continental observers marvelled at English prosperity, effective government, and cultural vitality. Otto Theron, the Holy Roman Emperor, sought marriage alliance with Athelstan's family. Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty in France, married his son to an English princess. Byzantine emperors corresponded with English kings as equals. This was remarkable recognition for what had been a besieged island kingdom just 3 generations earlier. The naval development that accompanied the Burh system's success deserves attention because it marked another transformation in English military capability. Alfred had recognised that Viking naval superiority was fundamental to their success. In response, he commissioned construction of larger warships designed to fight Viking longships at sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes these ships as nearly twice the length of Viking vessels, with 60 oars or more. These ships, whatever their actual dimensions, represented an attempt to contest Viking naval dominance. By the mid-10th century, England possessed a significant naval force capable of patrolling coasts and intercepting raiders before they reached land. This naval capability, combined with the Burh defences, created a layered defence system that made Viking raiding increasingly futile. The economic impact of secure seas was substantial. English merchants could trade overseas without constant fear of piracy. Fishing fleets could operate safely in English waters. Continental goods could be imported reliably. This maritime security, like the internal peace the Burhs provided, was a public good that facilitated economic growth across society. The diplomatic activity of English kings in the 10th century reflected their growing power and confidence. Athelstan, in particular, pursued an active foreign policy involving marriage alliances, military assistance to continental rulers, and diplomatic correspondence across Europe. This was possible because England's internal stability, based on the Burh system, freed royal attention for external affairs. The marriage alliances Athelstan arranged for his sisters and half-sisters connected the English royal house to virtually every major European dynasty. This wasn't just family aggrandizement. It created diplomatic networks that brought England into European political mainstream. English interests were now European concerns, and European rulers had to consider English reactions to their policies. The cultural exchange these diplomatic connections facilitated enriched England significantly. Continental scholars came to English courts and schools. English students travelled to continental monasteries and schools. Artistic styles, theological ideas, and political theories circulated across the Channel in both directions. England was no longer an isolated northern island, but an integral part of European Christian civilization. The ecclesiastical organisation developing in England during the 10th century built on the Burhs system's urban framework. Bishops established seats in major burhs, creating a network of urban cathedrals that served as administrative and spiritual centres. These cathedral towns became focal points for religious life, drawing pilgrims, students and clerics from across England and Europe. The monastic reform movement that swept England in the late 10th century, associated with figures like Dunstan, Ethelwald and Oswald, established new monasteries often associated with burhs. These reformed houses followed strict Benedictine rule and pursued educational, liturgical and artistic excellence. They became centres of learning and culture that contributed significantly to England's intellectual vitality. The wealth required to support this ecclesiastical development came largely from the commercial prosperity the Burh system generated. Merchants endowed churches, commissioned religious art, and supported monastic foundations. The Church, in turn, provided education, social services, and spiritual guidance that reinforced the urban commercial culture. This symbiotic relationship between commerce and religion was characteristic of the English synthesis. The demographic growth England experienced during the 10th century, while impossible to quantify precisely, was clearly substantial. The burhs grew from fortresses to towns to small cities. Rural populations increased as agricultural production intensified. The archaeological evidence shows continuous expansion of settled area, construction of new buildings, and proliferation of artifacts suggesting growing population and wealth. This population growth was both cause and effect of economic development. Growing populations required more food, driving agricultural intensification. Growing urban populations created markets for craft goods, encouraging manufacturing. Growing prosperity allowed people to marry earlier and support larger families, further increasing population. This virtuous cycle of demographic and economic growth characterised England from Alfred's time through the 11th century. The contrast with continental Europe during this period is striking. Much of Western Europe was still recovering from Carolingian collapse and Viking, Magyar and Muslim raids. Political fragmentation, insecurity and economic stagnation characterised many regions. England, by contrast, was unified, secure, prosperous and growing. The Burh system had created conditions for development that continental kingdoms wouldn't achieve for generations. When new Viking invasions came in the late 10th century under Sweyn Forkbeard and later Knut, they succeeded not because England's defences failed, but because English leadership faltered. Ethelred the Unready's indecisive policies and the internal conflicts among English nobles created opportunities Scandinavian kings exploited. But even successful conquest didn't destroy the Burh system or the society it had created. Snut's reign from 1016 to 1035 demonstrated the system's resilience. The new Danish king maintained English administrative structures, employed English officials, and governed through the boor network his predecessors had established. He recognised that the English system worked better than anything available in Scandinavia. Rather than imposing Danish methods, he became an English king who happened to be Danish. The ease with which Knut integrated into English kingship revealed how completely the cultural transformation initiated by Alfred's Burhs had succeeded. The distinction between Saxon and Scandinavian had become meaningless at the political level. What mattered was effective governance, secure defence, and prosperous commerce. These the English system provided regardless of the ethnic background of the king. The Norman conquest of 1066 presented final test of the society the Burhs had created. William the Conqueror took England through military victory, but he governed it through the administrative system he found. The Burhs remained the framework of local government. The road network, the taxation system, the legal structure all continued essentially unchanged. The Normans added a French-speaking aristocracy and modified some institutions, but the fundamental English character shaped by Alfred's Burhs persisted. The Domesday Book. William commissioned in 1086 reveals an England still organised around the Burr system's principles. Towns are assessed, their inhabitants counted, their obligations recorded. The countryside is divided into hides supporting urban centres. The whole kingdom is systematically surveyed and taxed. This was possible because the administrative infrastructure created for the Burhs had survived 2 centuries and multiple conquests. The long-term trajectory of English development owes more to Alfred's Burhs than to any single subsequent innovation. The commercial economy, the administrative sophistication, the urban network, the cultural synthesis of Saxon and Scandinavian elements all flowed from decisions Alfred made in desperate circumstances in the 870s and 880s. He was trying to save his kingdom from immediate destruction. He inadvertently created the framework for a nation that would dominate world affairs for centuries. The irony of Alfred's achievement was that his greatest success was invisible to contemporaries. They saw military victories, reconquest of lost territory, and defeat of the Vikings. What they didn't see was that the system he created would continue shaping England long after Vikings were forgotten. The Burhs didn't just stop raiders, they created a new kind of society where commerce trumped warfare, administration superseded personal rule, and ethnic integration replaced conflict. The transformation of Vikings into English townspeople and farmers was symptom of deeper change. Alfred had created a system so attractive, so prosperous, and so effective that people chose to join it voluntarily. The Burhs offered security, opportunity, and prosperity that raiding couldn't match. Given that choice, even the most feared warriors in Europe put down their swords and picked up ploughs and account books. This was Alfred's true genius. He understood that defeating an enemy wasn't enough. You had to offer something better than what they had, something so appealing that they would voluntarily become part of your society. The Burhs were the offer made tangible. They were fortresses that became cities, military installations that became markets, defensive positions that became homes. They turned enemies into citizens not through force, but through attraction. By the time of Alfred's death in 899, the transformation was well underway but far from complete. His successors built on his foundation, extending the Burh network, refining the administration, and completing the cultural integration. But the essential breakthrough was Alfred's. He saw that walls could do more than keep enemies out. They could create spaces where former enemies became neighbours, trading partners, and eventually fellow countrymen. The story of how Alfred's Burhs turned Viking raiders into farmers isn't really about Vikings or fortifications. It's about the power of creating systems that make peace more profitable than war, that make integration more attractive than conflict, and that offer everyone, regardless of background, a chance at prosperity and security. That system, embodied in 30 fortified towns scattered across southern England, changed the course of European history and created a nation that would shape the world.